afternoon. Thank you for your patience. As Louise said, my name is Virginia Bean, and I teach photography in the Department of Studio Art here at Dartmouth College. Thank you for coming to our spring term lecture by Artist-in-Residence David Hilliard. As Louise mentioned, you're invited to the opening reception for David's exhibition in the Jaffe Freedy Gallery on the main floor of the Hopkins Center immediately following the lecture. We are also today celebrating the work of our esteemed colleague, Esme Thompson, which is on exhibit in the adjacent Strauss Gallery. David Hilliard grew up in Lowell, Massachusetts, and he received his BFA from Massachusetts College of Art in Boston and his MFA from Yale University School of Art. I first met David about 15 years ago when we both were teaching at Harvard University. David's passion for teaching was apparent, and his interest in a wide range of students and educational settings has taken him from classrooms at Yale, Cranbrook Academy, and Boston's Museum School to workshops in art centers in Alaska, Provincetown, and Anderson Ranch in Colorado. David is currently assistant professor at his alma mater, Massachusetts College of Art. David has received numerous grants, including the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Fellowship and a Fulbright Fellowship to Spain. His photographs have been collected by the Whitney Museum of American Art, the LA County Museum, the de Cordova, Harvard's Fogg Museum, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and the Art Institute of Chicago Art Museum, just to name a few. He has exhibited widely, both here and abroad, including galleries and museums in Spain, Germany, and Italy. David's work is represented by Carroll & Sons in Boston, Yancey Richardson in New York, Jackson Fine Art in Atlanta, and Mark Moore in Santa Monica. Our library has a copy of David's beautiful monograph published by Aperture Books in 2005. I just spent a few minutes in the solitude of David's exhibition and was again struck by the luminous grandeur of his photographs as well as their startling intimacy. I would like to read two quotes about David's work. The first from an interview by Clayton Maxwell. Through his sensual, multi-paneled panoramic photographs, David Hilliard tells stories. Stories about desire, fathers and sons, masculinity unfolding, relationships that elude. Through a very tender, observant lens, he looks at his relationships with his parents, the anxieties of being a boy who doesn't thrill at boyish things, the longing of a young man, the mature awareness that we all have to say goodbye to the people we love the most, no matter how hard we may embrace them now. With different focal points throughout and an almost tactile emotional sensibility, the photos portray a beautiful, richly nuanced world, one that Hilliard both perceives and invents through his narrative images. And from the very fine essay in the exhibition catalog, I have a copy of it here if you want to see it, but a very beautiful catalog that the college has produced in honor of this work. And from the essay in the exhibition catalog by art historian and critic Francine Coslow Miller. As his photographs reveal lyric and multifaceted explorations of the human condition, Hilliard's ever-growing cast of characters continue to evolve as universal symbols for the paradoxes of existence. We all look forward to an exciting and stimulating term with David Hilliard. Please join me in welcoming him to Dartmouth College.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Is the volume okay? Is this good? Thank you, Virginia, very much. It is so exciting to be here, sincerely. I'm just now starting to come down from my technical anxieties that I was having, so forgive me if while I regain my composure. And thank you for the tech staff up there. I appreciate it. But it's thrilling to be here, to be at Dartmouth, to have been invited, which is humbling, to work again with Virginia, with Brian Miller, who I went to graduate school with, it seems like a million years ago, and to work with Gerald Otten, installing this beautiful exhibition. And I also want to thank John Crane, who's here, who really helped me immensely in installing the show, and is also teaching me how to knit. So it's a perfect place, I'll tell you. And I want to thank Francine Coslow-Miller, who is here, who Virginia just quoted, who we've become fast friends, and she wrote for my catalog, and it's an amazing writer, and hopefully some of you will get to meet her later at the opening if you attend. So it's thrilling to be here. I'm really looking forward to working with all the students. I've met some of you. We have lots of weeks ahead of us, but time goes by quickly, so we should jump in soon, right? So tonight I'm in the hot seat, you'll be in the hot seat, and we'll all make art together. So I'm looking forward to a good time here. I know there's not a lot of time and we're already behind schedule, so I'm gonna jump into showing my work, and I'm gonna check my time. What I thought I would do today is, because I assume many of you are interested in photography, some of you may not be, some of you may not respond to my work, which I can handle. So I thought what could be interesting as I show the work is to also just talk about, really talk about studio practice, what it's like to be an artist, how I make, when I succeed, when I fail, what I'm thinking about as I'm making some of the work. So I have two quick disclaimers. One is I'm going to talk a lot about some of these photographs, but I want to be clear that I don't expect you to read everything that I'm saying in the image. This is just my thoughts around the photograph and maybe how I would like it to function for me. But I love in the end that a photograph is universal and we can all experience it in our own way. Well, art is. So let me be clear on that. And moving forward, some of these slides might look a little funny. Please forgive me. Hopefully you can look at the work that's in the gallery and have a better sense of what things should look like. I'd like to start with work that is about, at this point, almost over 15 years old. This is work that I was making in graduate school. And it was really at a time when I was discovering that really photography was my passion. I was also trained as a filmmaker in undergrad, and I love film. I love narrative quality of film, the lyrical nature of a film, the event of a film, the ability to move through time and space in a moving image. Yet at the same time, it frustrates me because it is such a spectacle that it was often difficult to show it and to make them, and the time consumption involved, that at times I became disinterested and I started to fall in love with photography. Photography is much more simple, it's much more direct, it's very specific. It celebrates one moment in a really beautiful way. It gives you the ability to stare. So I was interested in, am interested in both photography and film. And early on, mostly while I was in graduate school, I started to join photographs together. I was using and continue to use a large format 4x5 camera. The photographs are 4 by 5 inches, the negatives, and their color. And what I do is I make photographs vertically or horizontally, linking photographs together, creating kind of movements through time and space, playing with the optics, playing with shutter speed, depth of field. In a sense, I like to think creating a hybrid kind of medium between photography and film. Let me be clear, I know that I'm not the only one working in multiple images, but many of us have our own special reasons for doing it, and that's kind of, I think, an entry into how I started to work. Also, photography for me, ever since I was a boy, has been a bit of a buffer. It has allowed me the ability to put something at times between me and the world, a world that I don't always feel comfortable within, events that I don't always feel at peace within. And there's something about photography as a mediator that I've always loved. It softens the experience of life at times. It allows me to bear witness in a way that I really enjoy. It also creates order, which I like. Makes life more palatable for me. And we can talk more about this as we move along. And I also encourage anyone to shout out a question at any point. I don't know if that's allowed here at Dartmouth. But if there's something a glaring error, please, somebody tell me. So that's where I'll start with. And the first work I began to make dealt with my father. At least for this little showing, I decided to, in a sense, compartmentalize my work, which isn't always my favorite thing to do. I've lumped together some pictures of my dad. I have some pictures that deal more with masculinity. And then moving into how I'm going to end this presentation, I start to join photographs together from different bodies of work, coalescing, I hope, into something that's a little bit more expansive, although thematic, but bring some of these themes together in a way that I'm more interested in. But my dad, interesting guy for me. This is Ray Hilliard. He's a retired factory worker, an ex-Navy man, Playboy reading, cigar smoking, Hawaiian shirt wearing guy. Taste is not, a big issue for him. And I love him. I can joke about him, but you know how it is with families. He's an armchair traveler, a historian, very interested in the history of World War II, follower of the naturalists, poets, philosophers, transcendentalists. Introduced me at an early age to Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson. And in a sense, is a guy who's out of step within his own life. He's all of these things, but he's also this kind of rough and tumble guy. And early on, he embraced me, his strange son who loved art and all things sensitive and turned out to be a gay man. And not that we didn't have our struggles, but he embraced me and continues to embrace me. So it seemed like a great starting point. And I continue to collaborate with my dad and to make work with him. And I revisit him as a character again and again throughout my work. So some of these that last one was called The Lone Wolf. I like to title photographs. This is called Feeding Gretchen, his beloved dog, which is no longer with us. He goes through a lot of dogs. So early on, 1994, probably, I'm making this work. It was the heyday of staged, I would argue, at that point, especially at Yale in the mid-90s, of a lot of self-referential, staged tableau photography, dealing with the personal. And I was really influenced by that work that was being made. And some of you, if you're interested, we could talk about more of these artists later that I was looking at. A lot of high-key lighting. I was looking at filmmakers as well, like Peter Greenaway, the Coen brothers, Hitchcock, Scorsese, David Lynch, and so all these things are going through my head. But I'm at the same time making these very mundane photographs of just a father and a son, referencing my demographic, lower middle class, Lowell, Massachusetts, Dunkin' Donuts, McDonald's, but at the same time trying to make really beautiful, I hope, tender photographs about our relationship. And this one is really just the moment of watching my father as he obsesses over his little dog.
Did somebody else take the picture?
No, I have it on a shutter release cable. So it's really, this is pre-digital. I have one of those cables with a plunger cord at the end, so I'm taking this photograph, and then maybe my father would take another photograph. And so there's not a lot of trickery going on. They're pretty straightforward images. But I love this kind of balance between fiction and reality and the everyday and something maybe spectacular. This photograph, this is probably going to be one of the worst projections, so forgive me. This is called His Problem with Plurality. In reality, it's about 20 feet long, this photograph, and it puts to rest my father's constant complaint about trying to find his cereal of choice. We would hear growing up, when I was a boy, I could never find the cornflakes. We would have cornflakes, oatmeal, and Rice Krispies, and now when I go to the supermarket, I can't find it, rah, rah, rah. So I hooked up with the supermarket, and I said, I want to make this photograph, and in the end made this photograph that is, I think, 7 panels long, each panel being about 30 by 40 inches. And until that moment where I get to my father, I'm just making more commodity, right? I'm just making more, it's not cereal, but it's just another thing. I'm making more product. So I'm interested in the kind of reference back to photography and back to consumerism, that I'm making more multiples. But then there's this moment where you have the kind of lumpy old guy finding his cornflakes that suddenly takes it out of the vernacular of like advertising photography. And the title came from him, his problem with plurality. So it's collaborative, to be sure. This is called Hot Coffee, Soft Porn. And no, really, I could make very different photographs of a lot of my upbringing that would be far less funny. But this was every summer there'd be a retreat of all the men in the family, and they'd go to this little cabin in New Hampshire, and they would drink and watch pornographic films. And it wasn't that I was against it, really. I just really wasn't interested in it. But I would go and, I would make art. And so it's my father and my uncle, and as we move panel to panel, it's that warm, the fleshy moment of the bouncing breasts and the glowing jugs in the foreground, and there's, so I'm kind of sculpting with space as I move along. And then there's a statue that sits atop the television, which is this huge Neanderthal, like this ape that's dragging a woman across that we always had. And I tell you, it's really, it didn't take a lot. Sometimes I just had to show up with the camera to make really interesting things. And this is my uncle, the kind of Homer Simpson moment of, and then my father and his beer stein collection. And but really, what I like about this photograph, aside from the initial, maybe the humor in it, is that at the end of the day, behind closed doors, we all have something kind of personal about ourselves, and we all have a sexuality, and we might not do this, but we do something else maybe that might cause someone else to raise their eyebrows. And I'm trying in my work to look at aspects of that, and I hope that's in the gallery a little bit. You'll see a bit of that scope. This is called 5 Chords. It's my uncle splitting wood. And it's really kind of like the cereal aisle. He's stacking wood and I'm stacking photographs. Backstory is that my poor uncle just doesn't want to go back inside the house because I have an aunt that is really a handful. And so he every year he lays in like way too much wood, enough for the community. And I mean, this is a photograph that I have to say is funnier if you know the story. But it could just be about a guy splitting wood, but he could heat like 5 homes for like 4 winters. But it's also obsession, and it's his knitting, if you will. It's his thing that he does to to center himself. And the photographs have lots of nice detail that I wish you could see. This is an even earlier piece called "The Bluebird Carries the Sky on His Back," which goes back to Henry David Thoreau. My father has these navy tattoos that, as a boy, I always loved, and so this is a picture of I'm outside shoveling snow in a Massachusetts winter, and my father sits behind these magenta curtains, and the light kind of comes in and casts this blue magenta kind of glow over him. So, really, I'm interested in, in my work and a lot of artists' work who make often beautiful, often even sometimes sexualized photographs of something that is less ideal than we would expect these photographs to be made of. So to make these, not that this is an erotic photograph, but to make these very tender photographs of my father is interesting. As Virginia had mentioned, I received a Fulbright grant not long after graduate school, and it was a great opportunity. Went off to Spain, made a lot of work, had a great time. And then when I came back, I decided I wanted to continue with the dad photographs. And what I had noticed is that he had aged a lot. I had changed. The work was sometimes a little less funny. I decided, my father's more complex than the Hawaiian shirt character I was turning him into. And what happened is, on this day, I went around twilight and the light was fading, and I went from a 5-second exposure to a 15-minute exposure as we move across in the 3 photographs, the middle panel being about a 5-minute exposure. So my poor dad is in there with that cigar trying, to maintain himself for the picture. And I thought the photograph had failed. Back to why I wanted to show you this photograph. This was one of those moments, as you artists know here, that you think you've completely effed up. You've failed. It's bad. The picture is no good. And then I took this work home and I put it up on the wall in my studio, and I was looking at it, and I love painting. I look at a lot of painting, and I realized this is as close as I sometimes get to a painting. Like just the way the light moves across and changes. And as a photograph, it's wrong. But as a color moment and as an emotional push into looking at something, it feels right. The way the architecture wraps around him, and the peeling paint describes time passing. It was really a happy surprise for me, this photograph, just called Dad. And it deals a little bit with Lowell, Massachusetts, the vinyl-clad homes and the chain link fences, and talks, a little bit to that demographic. Sip of water. Another lump of pictures here I threw in is, I guess I'll call it, the kind of rites of passage, masculinity photographs. I've always been interested in the identity of men, roles, expectations around being a man, the beautiful and often tragic male figure. And sometimes the photographs represent reference my own experience, but other times they might be someone else's experience. They might be, men that I never could be, men that I could never have, men that, or could literally be a moment that I had had. So the photographs go back and forth between really being autobiographical in a sense, and then sometimes just voyeuristic. This photograph called The Shirts versus the Skins, which is kind of out of focus. As home of the warriors, whatever you do, do to the glory of God. I had wanted to make a photograph about that moment when, at least when I was a boy, it's not very PC. I don't know if they do it anymore for young kids. They probably have something equally terrible they do. But we had to take our shirts off in gym class, and do guys still have that happen? Most guys don't mind. But you have to take your shirt off and play basketball and so they divide you in half. And no matter where I stood or averted my eyes, I was always chosen to be a skin. And it was awful, and I have not a great body, and the girls would be watching, and I couldn't play basketball, and I had a really cruel coach. And so anyway, that's why I go to therapy. That's my thing. But apparently I need to talk about it. But anyway, this picture I really did want to make a photograph. And I think that we all, as artists, we have those moments where you want to make something that is maybe not closure, but addresses a chapter in your life. And so I can't be that kid again. So I searched out another school that I could find where I could create this scenario. And it's hard to find, high schools that will let you photograph their students, with their shirts off. But it was, I ended up in Knoxville, Tennessee at a Christian high school of all places, and was so lucky because it said that on the wall. And these boys, I blocked the photograph, meaning I told everyone where to stand. I had all the lights. I was gonna just completely illustrate this photograph to death. And I got behind the camera, and I have the dark cloth over my head. And I'm about to make the photograph, and before I could tell the boys what to do, meaning like how to look, each kid broke into their own kind of moment. It had nothing to do with me. The kid on the left, that's me. That's how I felt. But he's like a boneless chicken. He's just like standing there. And then you have the basketball boy who has a face full of pimples, but he could not be any more beautiful or at ease with himself. The boy I wish I could be. And then you have the homeboy and the other boy, and so I managed to click one shot, and then they saw that I was photographing, and they lost all of that. And I made a series of other photographs, but none of them were as good as the moment that I had nothing to do with. And that's, I guess, what I want to say to you, and it's like the picture of my father at night, this photograph. It's those moments where your agenda hits the wall or is challenged by something outside of your control, and that's really magical when that happens. if you like the photo. But that's when I look at this photograph, I remember that, and I'm humbled by things that I can't control. I was, as Virginia mentioned, I would travel to Alaska sometimes to teach workshops, and one of the times when I was in Alaska, I was traveling by myself, and I noticed, and this is super, I'm being very general here, I noticed there were a lot of men with their boys. It seemed like, at least where I was in this point of Alaska, it was a really kind of a guy thing going on, and there was a lot of father and son activity, stuff that I never really did. My father never forced me to hunt or fish. We weren't really into that. But I found a lot of moments like this, and it was hard for me. It was hard to pull my little rental car over and like slosh through the marsh and approach these people with this imposing camera and ask to make these photographs, and a lot of rejection. But in the end, photographs like this here I really loved. I loved that I met this little boy, excuse me, who, you know, at least in my mind, looked a little worn out, looked like he didn't really want to be fishing anymore, was thrilled that somebody came along with something else other than a fishing pole, and so he was curious. He wasn't like, and so I had this moment with this kid, and he allowed me to photograph him, and I had him holding the fish up to his chest for a long time, and I must have worn him out. Then he politely asked if he could put the fish down, and he dropped the fish, and I noticed that he was covered in like gore, like blood and guts and mud, and then he started to, as I was setting up the camera, like getting ready to take it, he started to play with the string like an instrument, like up and down, and I had nothing to do with that moment. And again, like the athletic guys, it was that moment that was just outside of what I could have thought. I never could have had him do that. I couldn't have thought of this. And I love the gesture. I love that that's very simple, elegant gesture in this like epic landscape. And then his father is off to the side. His father was patient, but he wasn't really into it. So we sent him over there, and but then even like the wind blew and the dog like started to sniff, and so it's the photograph for me is very physical. It's in that way that it's very much about the tactility of all of that stuff and the scent of the air, and it's as close as I came in this trip to really capturing a sense of that landscape that was just overwhelming. Hulk. This is at a country fair in Connecticut. In about, I think this is 2002, 2003. The war in Iraq was really just starting to get going. And this guy, I saw him at this fair, and he's the kind of guy that I look at, and if you look at him too long, he could hit you kind of guy. But I had a lovely female assistant that day who, it's always a good idea to bring like the other gender, you know, it's just to be open to all situations. So she helped to work him into submission, and we got him to sit. And he's looking at me, and but he's really looking at my assistant, and he's looking at my camera, which in the book that Vince Aletti, who's a great critic, a great writer, interviewed me, and he said, you know, this man, you never could have gotten this man to look at you this way had you not had a camera. And initially when he said it, it seemed kind of silly, and then I thought of it, I said, that's really amazing, you're right. It's like, it really is, not that I was trying to seduce this man, but it's really the only way that I could have this kind of moment with somebody outside of, you know, my realm. Because he's looking at the camera and he's projecting his sense of who he is onto whatever audience he thinks this picture might go to. And it's a really amazing thing about the photograph, that it really is, it's slippery that way. That we go out and we think we know what we want, we have a control, but the sitter is also assuming certain things as well about not only how they look, but where the picture might go. And it is a subtle dance, or sometimes not so subtle dance, that goes on between you and your subjects. So I had him for 2 photographs, and he was gone. He freaked out. The minute he saw me working the Hulk doll into the picture, he didn't like it. But I managed to make, and the light was changing as it went across, so going from left to right, it got darker out. And what is nice about working this way for me is that I can deal with still life, portraiture, and I guess landscape in a sense. These various genres of picture making within one photograph. That it is a little decadent in that way, that I can, really think about making a portrait. And this, I really want to make a still life, and that the 3 or 4, depending on how I'm working, could play together in concert and create another read. That there are these individual moments, yet a continuum. Boys at a, just young men being boys, strangers that I don't make a lot of verticals, but it seemed kind of magical, and I wanted to reference the sky and the water, and they needed like a place to fly, I thought, or swim. Drinking, there's a lot of drinking in my photographs, which gets back to stuff in my family, and but I grew up around a lot of alcoholism, and I was teaching at this workshop this summer class that I was teaching, and the students were really the blotto. They were just drinking constantly, and so I made a few of these photographs of them altering their state of mind.
Is that Provincetown?
No, it looks like it though. No, it's Norfolk, Connecticut, which is a really beautiful place.
Did you need to get drunk?
Well, I don't know. But it just seemed like that particular summer there was a lot of that going on. This is my nod to, like, this photograph called Swimmers harkens back to maybe the 17th, I don't know if it's 17th, 18th, both century artist, Thomas Aikens.
19th century.
19th?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Are you sure? Okay, sorry. I know Dartmouth, I shouldn't, okay, sorry. I'm not gonna quote any more dates today, okay. But I love his photographs that often were then used for paintings, but, and they were at times homoerotic, but these beautiful photographs of like men and boys at swimming holes. And there was this one day in Connecticut that after some heavy rains, there was a stream that was flooding, and these boys were running amok. And it was this perfect, healthy, idyllic childhood moment. But I thought I wanted to go down and make a picture. And just to tell you, this is how I made the photograph. I made the photograph on the left, and the boys, I was kind of far away, and I asked them, and I set up the camera. And then I asked one boy who's in that picture if he could then sit for the next photograph. So I created this moment of the odd boy out, this angsty moment that in reality really wasn't happening. And then I felt fortunate that there was a pile of these very contemporary, very kind of beefed up, highly colored mountain bikes in the distance there. So it's my contemporary version of the swimmers. And in reality, in the actual photograph, there's a beautiful description of his backside and the sun on his back.
The figure also looks like the figure in the Seurat painting.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about, when I think about painting, and I look at a lot of contemporary painting, but I tend to go for like the darker Baroque paintings and like the Vermeer moments, and
Just like that.
yeah. But I do, I tell you, the other day I was teaching in Boston and there was some kind of apathy that was in the air with the students that day, and I got them all up and we walked over to the Museum of Fine Arts, and I forced them to look at painting. And it was the best thing, is like, when in doubt, like look at master painting again and really see how they saw, what it means to slow down and see. These are two brothers in upstate Michigan after losing a football game. Just kind of interested in the kind of lack of armor. I decided to show this one here. It's a photograph that I quite like. But again, back to landscape, I really love the use of landscape. And back to painting, I think of the Hudson River School painters. And just like deep landscape, but when at all possible, the idea that you can use the tone, like you can use weather as a kind of parallel for an emotional moment, like the morphing weather along with this kind of young teen moment of maybe self-doubt, their kind of connectedness and disconnectedness, but also that the boys have a rope that's connecting them. That this boy's body, I think he's 15 years old, and you can almost hear him growing. Just like that kind of body that's morphing. And it just seemed right in this weather, that the weather's changing, his body's changing, and yet there's this kind of stillness. And also a very muted color palette that I really love. This is called Of a Certain Temperance. It's a moment of a man who is tattooed from head to toe, and he's atop his fiancée, but there's this blanket between them. And she initially appears like, perhaps objectified or dominated, but really she has this blanket. She's not letting him in. She is looking at him, and he's staring her down, and I guess I'm thinking, for me in this photograph, it's about a kind of control that she has over him. And his body is just, I can't help think of that famous Arbus quote. I'm going to get it wrong, but something about, Deanne Arbus says something about that it's funny in life that we're given this set of characteristics that you can't help, that you're born with. And then it's interesting that on top of that, many of us choose to create another set on top of that to make your life even more complicated, perhaps. I'm not saying this guy has a complicated life, but he's basically changing his race almost. It's crazy. And then, of course, there's a Vermeer, which couldn't have been better, and the little Fidelity dog there. So it's again, back to my agenda, I go there, but I was very pleased to find that their house was just full of all kinds of stuff that I never could have. It perfectly described being 20-something now, almost 30-something, and it also describes where they are in their life. They're really, planning a marriage, and it's an interesting time. I don't know. I felt fortunate to photograph a couple at this time in their life. Earlier photograph, back to the one of my father with the hot coffee and the soft porn. This is another moment. In this case, it's two men where the viewer is, I like the idea of, at times in photographs, implicating the viewer, that you actually create a space that is, in this case, voyeuristic, that on the left and the right-hand panels, you have architecture, and then there's an open door in the middle, and you look through the door, and there's this moment, and depending on your politics or your persuasions, that you may or may not want to look. So it is this kind of moment that you come upon. And in the left panel, you have the terry cloth, nicely focused in reality. The right-hand panel, there's a shower curtain, but through the door, you have this kind of testicle moment that it's not just, and the thing, it's not just about sex between two men, but in this case, there's also something more intimate. It's about love. Like the idea of the kiss, even, was for me much more interesting than if they were just going at it. The idea of like the kiss and making that photograph. And I will say, just in a nutshell, that I was making this work at a time. This is right at the end of graduate school, and I continue to make work like this today, but where I was, basically I wanted to make pictures like this. It was a guilty pleasure. But I also felt like that in the history of art, that there weren't a lot of photographs like this. Certainly there are not a lot of paintings like this. And although I consider myself politically active as a gay man, and I stand up and I'm counted, and there's a lot of work that I could make, but I think that sometimes some of the quiet work that you can make about same-sex relationships are equally as powerful as perhaps louder, more aggressive works. This one is obviously slightly aggressive, but I was making a lot of really kind of sweet pictures of men and women together. I mean, men with other men, women with other women. This is another one. This is called Rising. It was initially 7 photographs long. I wanted to make a photographic haiku, was my idea, that it was going to be these 7 moments that were going to, it didn't, 4 of them were good. And it became, but I was thinking about like ephemeral time, eternal time, that's a rock in the water. And then our place somewhere within that, an implied narrative. It could be 2 men or it could be the same man. People read this often as a metamorphosis of this figure rising out of the ooze. I got so much flack about what this was. People thought it was a baked potato, a loaf of a baguette, you know. But no, it's a rock. And again, thinking of painting, this work, I did a lot of softening techniques in the darkroom. This is not digital. I'm using a lot of gauzes and papers to create these very soft. If anybody ever wants to do this, it's fun. So I was changing the look of some of these photographs. Okay, last thing, and I have to do a time check because we started late. What time were we officially supposed to start?
4:30.
Oh, okay. I should stop in any minute. This is a series of photographs that I started to make some years ago. I mentioned my father. One thing I didn't mention about my father is that he is a devout atheist on top of everything else. Or as he likes to say, a recovering Catholic. And my parents have been divorced since the 70s, and my mother lives in Southwest Florida and had remarried and is now a widow, and is a born-again Christian and evangelical born-again Christian. And I spend some time down there and trying to make sense of this. Somehow the projector got moved, I think. I don't know if you can hear me up there, but I'm losing the end of some of the pictures. And so I started to go to Florida making photographs of my mother's world. It was hard for me, as you can imagine. Just Florida in general is a tough place to make photographs. And then being kind of paralyzed by her faith, her spiritual belief system, and who I am and who she is, but I love her. And but I would go and I would make photographs, and so I started to just photograph in her world. This is the Walmart. This is called Perennial. It's every flower in bloom at the same time, artificial flowers. And I had made a portrait of my mother in the aisle, and I got all that out of my system, and then she stepped out of the frame, and suddenly this light shot down the aisle, and I thought, you know what? I think I'm starting to make photographs about her spiritual side, I think, or my take on it. So this is this was a turning point photograph for me, and I started to, and it's full of all this detail, and it's her place. This is her world. This is a photograph a week after my stepfather had passed away. This is called Widow. I had gone down to Florida to help her with arrangements, and thinking about the photograph I had made years previous of my father at his window, kind of alone and in his world, and my mother alone in her world on separate sides of the country. It's interesting to go back and make a companion piece 10 years later or what have you. I don't like the pressure of having to work in a linear, like I tend to jump around a little bit when I make work. I don't know if I've ever finished a project. This is called Jesus in the Guest Room. This is my mother now. It's interesting growing up in New England, and now she lives in Florida in this white stucco house. But this is one of those lenticular photographs that it's like a holograph. It follows you as you move around the room, and it changes, turns into the. Francine, help me. What is it called?
It turns into the Shroud of Turin.
Yes, thank you. But I tried to make a photograph where it was actually turning it, but I couldn't do it. So he's just Jesus here. But it was. As a boy, I was always confronted with this picture in New England, and here I am years later in the guest room, and he's still checking me out. And so what I should say is, as I'm going now toward the end of these photographs, that I'm making work about and this is work in progress, where I am starting to think about our search for some kind of spiritual self. It could be religious, theoretical, transcendentalist, existential, whatever you need to find your place in the world. So I have, and this work is kind of bookended between images of my father and my mother, which are on both sides of the religious spectrum. And then within that, I'm working in other photographs that are completely non-related outside of my personal world of other people and their quests. And I'm starting to make more landscapes and non-peopled photographs. So this is my father's journal, if you will. This beautiful penmanship of the quotes from various high thinkers, mostly men, mostly men. This is from Robert Greene Ingersoll. He's an American leader, Civil War veteran, and free thinker. And it's in the center of the photograph. It says, "You have no right to erect your toll gate upon the highway of thought," which is true. It's my father's, this is his free thinking, free speech journal. So he doesn't really share his personal thoughts. It's just quotations. But they're beautiful, and they're full of his mistakes. You can see where he misspells and then gets white out and corrects it, and he's really working to improve himself. You can actually, do I have anything connecting me? No. You can see where he misspells conscious, and then he whites it out and corrects it, and it moves me. It's really, my father is pretty amazing like that. And then there's a quote here. It says, and many of you know this, where it says, "A scorpion wished to cross a river. 'Let me ride on your back,' he said to the frog. And the frog said, 'Oh no, you will bite me and I shall die.' And the scorpion said, 'Don't be silly. If you die, then I shall drown. So certainly I will not bite you.' Halfway across the river, the scorpion bites the frog. 'Why?' asked the dying frog. And I think the scorpion says because it's my nature. And it's a little bit kind of silly in the context of the other pieces of writing. But again, that's my father, the enigmatic kind of scope of his, what he finds to be important. And it is like crawling around in his brain a little bit. So I've been photographing these journals. Sorry. This is called Granite Kiss, which is the Yankee term for when you're building a stone wall and you crush your finger between two rocks. So it's, metaphoric. It's my father building more walls in his life, for better or worse. This is my mother reading the Bible on the beach. This is called Hug. One of the things that, in a recent photograph, I thought, and it is a self-indulgent, I don't know, it's a new photograph. I haven't exhibited very much, but I wanted to make a photograph where I'm actually hugging my father. Before I no longer have him, I was feeling that it might be meaningful to actually have something that is a little bit more aggressively affectionate with this man. And so I wanted to, at least in the canon of my work, have a moment where I'm hugging him. Landscape. This is the Concord River as it runs through Lowell, Massachusetts, which Lowell is the birthplace of lots of industry, and the Concord River with the naturalists and Thoreau and Emerson. And so it's where my father's worlds collide. And so I wanted to make this landscape. This is called Mary Remembering, so we're back in Florida now. So this is my mother, my grandmother, and my great aunt. And my grandmother, who's completely senile and in the middle, and she's no longer there, but they get her up every day and they do her hair, and she just repeats herself all day long. And that's how you spend your day, in 90 degrees on the lanai. This is called A Good Confession. I just made this photograph. This was in Aspen, Colorado, where I was just teaching a workshop, and something about the feet of Jesus really struck me. And as a boy, I was always horrified by that moment on the crucifix. It's called Day Books. So lots of people reading in these photographs for various reasons. Sometimes it's spiritual, sometimes it's the Bible. In this case, it's two men art books together in this cabin. It's my tender moment between two men. Bible study in Southwest Florida. This is my niece who became a statistic. She had a baby at 18 years old, and that's her boyfriend, and that's their new pit bull dog. And but you know, he's in the picture, and they're reading their baby magazines, and so all of this stuff is happening at the same time. And I realized that there was a lot of like reading going on in these photographs. Fairly recent photograph myself with my father. Honestly, there are just a few more pictures. I know we've got to get going. This is called Rock Bottom. And for me, it's really determination versus determinism. I always say the same thing about this photograph, but it's my father and who he is, and I am the best and the worst of my father, and I am determined to be some things he's not, but other things are predetermined. I am like him in certain ways. And so it's the struggle that, it's both of our struggles, and the space in the middle represents, for me, the kind of distance between us, and it's split yet again with the horizon line. But it is kind of a path that I'm on, and he is a part of it. Bluebird, which was just a little girl in the Upper East Side who could not be any more different than me. She's a little girl, she's from this certain class, but she wants to be a bluebird. And it was just so funny because I just made those bluebird tattoo photographs, and I went there and she wanted to be this bluebird. But I decided to put it in this body of work because she really is no different than she's still kind of searching. And I love the tone of this photograph, and I love that it's so counter to some of the other photographs. This is my mother. This is called Hers Alone. Despite all of the Bible's teachings about charity and sacrifice, my mother has not thrown anything away since 1972. So it's this, and it's her dirty little secret. And so this is little back room where because the rest of the house is like the Jesus room, and it's all, but then you go in this other room, and there's like shampoos and everything on the floor, and it's, but it's really, I think it's about her fear. It's her fear of not having something. This is called Rouse, another brand new photograph, but this is some of my mother's friends from the church. They get together and sometimes have sleepovers. But I was interested in making this photograph that's full of these gestures because basically I'm moving around them with the camera. And so it's a combination of holding, helping, hugging. It doesn't really add up, but it's this kind of morphed, multi-paneled holding picture. And the hands are like leathery and full of gold, but I'm getting a sensibility there, and I think this is the last picture I have today. And this was a photograph that I had at one point decided I didn't want to use when I was in Alaska. There was just this random turret, like sitting in the landscape. And I would drive by it on my way to make the pictures that I thought I needed to make. And on the last day, I thought, I have to just pull this car over and photograph the turret. And I'm glad I did, because in the end, it's, I don't know, it is something, it is this kind of, at some point, somebody believed in something. It's like that had a use and a history, and it makes sense to me sitting there in the lonely landscape in this body of work. And so And I wanted to show it because sometimes you have to make that picture that feels maybe wrong or superfluous. Just make it. It's a picture. The last thing I would say is maybe about balances. In my work, and in many artists' work, I think we think about balances. And I made a little checklist here. My balances for me in making work and sharing it with an audience is, it's my experience maybe versus your experience and how the photograph's interpreted. The resolved in photographs and the unresolved, open-ended narratives. Reality versus a kind of fiction. Form and content, which sounds so lame, but it's the truth. Like, you have to think about how something looks and what it means, what it is and how it looks. I try to bear that in mind constantly. Film versus photography, the mundane versus something perhaps more extraordinary. And then something that I talked I think a bit about is serendipity, like the idea of going into something with a kind of control and then being open to something blindsiding you and that being okay. I think that's it. I ran over, but we started a little late. Thank you very much. No, I know that lots of people have to go, and if you have to go, you go. We are going to go over to the gallery for an opening, but if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take a couple. Yes. Why did I? I don't know. You know, he had them, and I'm not like a huge tattoo aficionado. But as a boy, I always loved them, and I thought if there's one thing that I could do while he's alive, it would be interesting to get the same tattoo. And he went with me, and it was a big deal for him that I would get. And it was something, I have to confess, he was always embarrassed in his later life about his tattoos. So it was a way of saying, that's okay. And so mine are much more stylized, and I think a little better than his tattoos. But yes.
Wait, excuse me just a minute, please. If people need to leave, if people need to leave, please do so quietly, because there are many others who would like to stay and ask David a few questions. So, shh.
Thank you. Sorry. Yes.
I'm sure the effect of your photographs will be different without you telling us the stories behind them. But do you think your photos would be complete without the stories behind them?
Yeah, I think that they are. I'm sorry, he asked if the photographs are complete without the stories behind them. And they're complete in a different way. I mean, today I have the luxury of being here and be able to kind of overtalk my work, which is what was my plan. That was my plan today. But I think that the photographs, usually if you see an exhibition of my work, there's a general statement about the work, and then the photographs, they usually have some kind of title, and I believe that there's usually room within the photographs to have your own experience and come up with a kind of narrative. But you're right, a very different, I mean, you would never get some of what I said today, and that was my disclaimer at the beginning. But I do hope that the photographs are open to interpretation and are complete in their own way. But I can't guarantee that, but I would say yes, that they are resolved in that way for me. Yes?
I guess I'm interested in your working in multiple photographs. Do you think of yourself as working in, do you think of them as like a triptych or more depending on the number of panels? Or have you ever considered working in a single image? Or what's the importance of the separation for you?
Yeah, I don't, the question is, the multiplicity factor, and is that permanent in my work in my studio practice? I would say at this point it kind of is. It's the way that I've chosen, and I get that question a lot, and I feel like I never have a really good answer for it because I enjoy working the way I work. It's like my camera now has multiple windows, and not that I don't make, I think, competent single photographs, but I can't, to this day, I make a photograph and I look to the right and I look to the left and I want to build it out. And even when I preconceive a photograph, it usually has these components that happen in different frames. So at this point, it is my practice, and I can't say that that won't change. I try to challenge it. I have to say, although I've been working this way for a good many years, I still try to keep it fresh, back to like the form and the content. And it's not as easy making pictures now. It's funny, as we get older, it seems like it's, I don't know, other artists might say something else, but I do feel like I work hard to challenge that. And yet, I do, in many of these photographs that I've shown, at the same time, I do make details. I do make photographs, and I've been asked if I might consider showing them at some point. I have a series of photographs of single images that I make when I'm there, but they never feel as interesting to me as the full-on, multiple-paneled work. So, yes.
At the beginning of your talk, you were talking about stage photographs, and you showed the picture of your father in bed with the magazine. And I'm just curiosity, how much of that was staged, like the window being slightly open and the flowers
Yeah.
next to the bed? I mean, did you move things around, or is that the room?
I'm glad you asked that question, and I almost said it earlier, and it's funny because Brian Miller's here, who I went to graduate school with, and you probably don't remember this, but when I first made that photograph in graduate school, I was studying with Gregory Crutzen, who's a great contemporary photographer that some of you may know about. But he said to me in my critique of that work, of that piece, he was commending me on building this incredible set. And I was like, and I love his work, and he is a master, you know, but we are very different in a lot of ways. And I joked sheepishly. I said, well, you know, I just brought the lights, you know, and it's true. I mean, when I look at that photograph, the only thing that I did is I played with some of the props. Everything was there, the silk flowers, the little deer heads, everything. They're still there. They hang in. I have a cottage now in Maine, and they were his parents, and so all of that was there. But I think bringing the lights, I think, creates a high key augmentation of that event. And the Playboy magazine that he has in his hands is the first issue of Playboy, and in the foreground was the most current issue of Playboy. So if you look at the actual photograph, there's a little play of time of like how many years he's been reading Playboy. So I did little things like that. But honestly, in that particular photograph, it was like fish in a barrel or whatever they say. It was just lights.
The newspaper. I mean, because the newspaper is that one moment where it's gray in the photo.
Yeah, I mean, it was there. I probably stylized certain aspects of it. But so maybe some of the finer details. But honestly, the space itself, nothing. No. And many of the photographs were really, it's the joy of having a good place to work is that it's so easy to make pictures in these locations. Yes. Francine.
I've always wondered from watching your work over the years, because I taught at Mass Art when you were a student there, right?
Right.
So I saw some of the early stuff, and I often wondered if your work would be as good if you didn't have the family that you had. And
You're gonna make me cry.
it's like you often, would you say, one time we were going over it and you said, oh my God, we're talking about such crazy people. And I said to you, no, they're really universal. I mean, they're very specific, each one. I mean, you've got your father who was, you know, in the Navy, and now he's not working, right?
Right.
And your mother, who is this very physically beautiful, born-again Christian. There's always this calm.
Yeah, that's a great project, right? I was handed that.
There's that
Yeah.
calm
Yeah.
after them. It's
Yeah.
just not my father, or
Yeah.
they're just not your average
Yeah.
type. Or your uncle Homer Simpson.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like you have a cast of characters that you were born with that I think and you've grown with that have helped you develop to be the great photographer that you are. And it's great that you're here to tell the stories, but I think there's such strong characters.
Yeah, I mean,
Tell us the people that you picked.
I appreciate you saying that, and I'm lucky I survived them as great character. I mean, they're also, I mean, I grew up in a totally dysfunctional world, and I'm still recovering from it. But they love me to the best of their ability, but I think everyone in this room could, thinking about people in their family, yourself included, because we've shared some stories. I mean, no, but we all have, I think there's fodder for in all of our families. And then and at least in my case, then on top of that, I'm, a minority, I'm a gay man. And so I had a lot of stuff to work with. And not that everybody works that way. A lot of artists don't even look at themselves, and it's about other, but I can't argue that, but I would argue that probably a lot of people, I think everyone in this room could write a short story about many people in their life, so.
I think that also, sorry to be talking so much, but I just wanted to share this with people, that most of my friends who are photographers always have their camera with them, waiting for that moment. In our relationship, you haven't done that all the time, and I think that's what's really wonderful. Do you want to tell the story about me with the flowers bringing to Dad's grave? Remember?
Well, I feel like I should tell it, but I don't know if I know it.
You live right near where my recently deceased father is buried, and I'm Jewish, and there was no marker yet. We had to make sure that the marker was okay. And the first time I came over, I was talking a lot about it, while we were kind of like picking which images we were going to do. And I had this poor little geranium.
Yeah.
And I'm supposed to put flowers that I was going to sneak over there. And you said, when you were talking about that, I was thinking how I would have loved to take Francine placing that flower.
Oh, yeah, okay, I remember that.
But I won't let you. I won't do that to you. I'll give you your privacy.
Yeah.
So then the next time I came over, it was warmer out. It wasn't muddy. And the marker was up. And I asked you if you would please come with me. And do you remember, you didn't take your camera again?
No, we just had the moment, but this is, in a way, how photographs percolate.
Right.
You're thinking about it, and so instead we went to the cemetery. And because sometimes art can get in the way of experiences sometimes, which is
Right.
very dangerous. And I've ended a lot of relationships, well, people have ended them with me, because it's all-consuming. And so I've learned that you have to let things sit, and then there's a time and place for making art. But that's also a wonderful thing, is that you meet people, you develop the relationship, you make the work, and you and I went there, and so next time we'll make a picture, and then we're at the cemetery, and somebody had knocked over gravestones, and we were setting up gravestones.
Ancient Jewish cemetery.
Yeah.
My father's not in it, and somebody had come there and knocked down the gravestones, and he and I were walking around picking them up.
Yeah.
And so stories happen while you're living, and then he comes, and then I think you're a director.
Yeah.
When you're thinking.
Well, that goes back to your question. I think that all of us have stories. Everyone in this room. Were there any? You had a question. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Have you always taken pictures that are kind of constructed and not, like you said, how some photographers carry their cameras waiting for something to happen? Have
Yeah.
you always kind of shaped your?
Yeah, I mean, that's back to my schooling. I studied at Mass College of Art in Boston with a lot of photographers that kind of built their photographs, a lot of staged photographs. And then I went to graduate school. And so I think I come from a long history of working with artists who work within the tableau, like the constructed photograph. But I also loved, years ago, I mean, when I go back, some of my favorite photographers, Gary Winogrand and Lee Friedlander, and even people today, we were talking in Virginia's class, we were talking about Richard Billingham, and lots of photographers who work in very light, ethereal ways with small cameras. And I loved that history of photography. I dabbled in that during my earlier education, but in the end, I'm much more interested in kind of the slowing down and this kind of collaborative nature of working. And so I didn't always work the way that I work now, but I quickly landed upon it and haven't really moved from it. Yes?
I have a technical question, which I don't know anything about photography, but does photography, do you interact with the digital technical aspects of photography, and how does that affect your work?
I think if you don't, as an artist today, you're in trouble. And so I am using a camera, a big film camera. I'm shooting 4x5 color film. They now make digital backs for these cameras that I have certain problems with, and they're very expensive, and I haven't bought one yet. So at this point, I'm shooting film. About half of the work that I make is then scanned and produced as inkjet prints. About a quarter or 2/3 of the work in the gallery are analog traditional prints, and a third are digital prints. So some of the work is from scan negatives, and some of the work are traditional prints. But I'm slowly going over to digital. I have to. I don't love it. I mean, you can't tell. They look amazing. I work with wonderful people, but I don't love that change is happening. And that's I don't know how, but we talk about this a lot, artists. But I'm not making that transition easily. It's
not that it's
cumbersome.
lesser.
No.
Isn't less.
Digital is an amazing. I think the great day will come when we stop comparing them.
Yeah.
They're just two different animals, and you can't help but compare them. I know that's not possible, but one isn't better than the other. They're just different, but unfortunately, genetically, analog it's dying. It's going to go.
For somebody who knows nothing about it, what is the difference in between, what do you lack in a digital photograph that you get in a
I think a real digital printer would say nothing, that I can make it look exactly the same thing, but because I know how to print color photographs, and for me, it's like sculpting and paint. I'm a pretty good color printer. So what's lacking for me is when I make a digital print, they look clumsy, and I don't have the curves down. But I think that they can look the same. One thing I will say that's very interesting that I just realized, that now when I have a picture, and for example, this is on a digital file, this photograph. Once it's established and it sits on a hard drive somewhere, you don't question it anymore. You need another print, you pop out another one. It sounds easier than it is, but it's something like that. If I were a traditional printer with a color darkroom in the wet lab, I would make that picture again, and I might learn how to make it better. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, you look at that and say, oh, geez, that cloud is, you make changes to it, you grow it, they're like your children, it's like, so I think there's a trap in a lot of digital, if you don't question it. I think you have to just keep that questioning sensibility when you're looking at, because I think digital can make you a little lazy. That's the good old boy comment, but, so, yes.
I have a question about the 3 images of your father sitting in the kitchen in Lowell.
Mm-hmm.
I think you were talking about the middle image, and you said that as a photograph, you felt like it failed in some way, but as a painting, for some reason, as a composition, it worked a little bit better.
Yeah.
And I didn't really understand, it didn't really make sense to me.
Yeah, I don't know what I was saying. Are you a painter? I might be in trouble now.
No, I'm actually not a painter or a
Oh.
photographer.
I just think that sometimes photography has a lot of these rules. Like when we make, photography is full of rules. It's so, every medium is, but photography especially, there's the on-color photograph. If you go into the gallery and look at my photographs, many of them are not on color. A lot of them have a veneer of a color wash that I've chosen to put over them. And so I like that. I like that a photograph can have a tone to it, and that in that particular photograph, I could never make those panels match. They just can't, because the light is different. And I think traditionally in the rules of photography that's wrong, that's a failed photograph. But I guess I was thinking that if it were a painting, if it was a triptych painting, that would be okay. Like the light would change and we would just accept that. It would be beautiful about it. But in photography, it's often deemed incorrect in general. So I found that when I looked at that photograph in terms of painting, or in other terms, that suddenly it was very successful. And all the broken rules and all the failures were actually what made it beautiful to me. So I don't know if it's just a painting thing, but yes.
Excuse my voice, wait.
Wow.
So in your sketchbook, or do you, like, your preliminary work?
Yeah.
Do you draw?
I draw, and I not very well, but I also shoot a lot of Polaroid film, which is now discontinued, and I have like warehouses of it. Like I'm a junkie. So I do preliminary photographs with the 4x5 in the back of with the Polaroid film to look at it. But I do a lot of sketches, and I often revisit. There are times that I shoot something twice, 3 times before I get it right. But there are times that overthinking a photograph, and I don't know what your leanings are. Do you make art?
Yeah, I do.
So I don't know how you feel about it, but I find that when I have a preconceived idea of what I want something to be, and I nail it, and I pin it to the wall, that butterfly has all of its, that's often disappointing. It's like I basically illustrated exactly what I wanted it to be, and nothing else kind of happened back to something outside of your own control. That's not always the case, but most of the times I'm less interested in something where I got exactly what I wanted. No, I just like it when there's a little accident. A little slippage is always good in art in general.
Do you draw, you know, how you break up the pictures, do you draw that?
Yeah.
That way, or is it
Yeah.
afterwards?
No, I draw it in that way, and even when I go out in the world, I kind of look and I have this, it's weird. It's especially strange if somebody's watching me, because I do this whole like crouching thing. It's like a tribal dance or something, but it's like, and then you set up the camera and I move it around. It takes me forever sometimes. I just sit there, I'm like a madman out on the landscape with a cloth over my head. And but then once I nail it, so it is a little bit of a dance around a subject, but it's enjoyable. I love it. Yes.
Yes, I may clarify her question. I am teaching drawing.
Mhm.
I took today for the class a book of Cartier-Bresson.
Yeah.
So I told the story of himself starting as a photographer, and ending up loving his drawings and dedicating the last years of his life just pure drawing.
Yeah.
So could you comment as a photographer or speculate why that happens sometimes?
Why an artist might.
After so many years and being so established, make that turn?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I'm qualified to make that. It hasn't happened. At this point, I still love photography. But when you were saying that, I think and I wish I could maybe help me out here, think of certain artists that often tire of, they burn their negatives, and they feel like they don't want to make. Wasn't it Robert Frank who destroyed all those beautiful photographs from the Americans or the books, or he just. I think a lot of artists tire of aspects of their work, or feel like they're being represented or viewed in a certain way, or they don't want to repeat themselves, and so they search out another way of working. But I don't know. I know the history that you're talking about, but I don't know if I can add any more. At this, I feel like I'm lucky that at this point, as a mid-career artist, I think that's officially what I am now, that I still love what I'm doing. I still love every day I get up and I think about pictures, and it's actually when I'm making photographs that I feel the most complete as a person. You know, that sounds like really big, but it's often when I'm the happiest. It's like, wow, it's like there's nothing like that feeling of making something that you feel is good. So I haven't had that happen. That would be a sad day, and I hope that I'm like Bresson. I hope that I could find something that is equally, I don't know what it would be. I don't know if I'm good at anything else, but that's a good question. I didn't really answer it, I'm sorry. Yes. One more question, and yes.
Well, in relation to that, maybe you said that you started out with film, and then
Yes.
you talked, well, that could be kind of like a change of medium. Like for me, like I'm doing, I started out writing and doing some cinematography and stuff, and then right now I'm doing a little bit of photography. But yeah, I was interested in how you made that change.
Yeah, I don't know. I still love film. I mean, I'm a junkie. I look at film all the time, and one of the great joys of being here is that I can go to the film series, and I think that maybe I could go back to film one day. I don't know what I would do, but I think that would be maybe an area that I would return to, is become, dabble in film again. Yeah, I don't know. I think that.
I think you're still making film.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's just slow.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Like slow food.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like I've kept you here for a long time. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.